The inventory took 4 hours, and I missed the alarm. Not the first time I'd done that. The sub-level storerooms were well insulated, the ventilation ran loud, and if you were deep in the back shelves counting dry-pack containers with a clipboard in your hand and a low-level preoccupation about whether your daughter had remembered to bring her transit card to school that morning, you could miss most things. I'd missed the midday chime before. I'd missed the end-of-shift bell twice in my first season, before I'd learned the palace's particular rhythms and the way they traveled through stone. I'd missed, the previous winter, a storm advisory that caught me crossing the outer service yard with a trolley of roof repair supplies and left me soaked to the skin and thoroughly annoyed at myself for the better part of an hour. What I had not previously managed to miss was a Tier 1 orbital precaution. I came up the service stairs at the end of the 4th hour with my clipboard, my completed count, and a mildly sore left knee. The stairs always found the left knee and stepped into the service corridor on sublevel 1, empty. Not unusual at that hour. The corridor sometimes ran thin as staff moved on to their next assignments. I checked the time on my marker board, 5:15 hour. The end-of-shift bell hadn't gone. I walked on to the main service hub. The hub was where the day crew gathered for the last rundown before dismissal. I walked through the connecting passage and found it empty too. Lights on, ventilation running, the administrative boards along the far wall displaying their steady green indicators. No people, not one. I stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at this. Then I looked at the administrative board more carefully, because something was pinned under the morning's duty roster in the position reserved for emergency notices, and emergency notices were worth reading. Tier 1 orbital precaution, palace clearance initiated. All non-essential residential staff to report to Civil Transfer Station 4. Departure COMPLETED 5th hour transport, Palace SCALED, until further notice. I read it twice. Then I went to the far window and looked out at the service yard. The transport pad was clean in the way a surface only got clean after hours without traffic. The fine dust settle of an area that had seen no movement since the last departure. The sealed gate had a yellow precautionary light pulsing its slow, patient rhythm above the arch. The sky beyond it was the usual city pale gray of early evening, and there were no vehicles on the outer approach, and there was no sound of any kind except the ventilation and the particular distant hum that the palace's heating system made when it shifted into its automated overnight cycle. I went back and read the notice a third time. 5th hour transport. I had come up at 5:15 hour. The transport had gone. I had been in the sub-level storerooms doing supply inventory, and the emergency alarm had run, and everyone in the palace had mustered at the transport pad and departed for Civil Transfer Station 4, and I had missed it by 10 minutes, perhaps 15. The palace was sealed. External communications, I knew from the general orientation they gave all palace staff at the start of a posting, ran on emergency channels only during a Tier 1. Those channels required an authorization code held by the Imperial Household Security Division, which was, at this moment, presumably at Transfer Station 4 along with everyone else. My personal communication line could reach the city through the standard residential grid, but that grid was cut when a Tier 1 was called. I could receive emergency public address broadcasts. I could not originate contact with anyone on the outside. Standard duration for a Tier 1 orbital precaution, 72 hours minimum, maximum 7 days. I sat on the corner of the duty desk and thought about that. My daughter was in the city with my sister. Sale was 16, going on 17 in less than a month, and had the kind of practical competence that seemed excessive in a teenager, until you remembered she had grown up in a household where the primary adult was also frequently distracted by dry goods inventory. She would have received the public address notification of the Tier 1. She would know I was sealed in. She would handle this by telling my sister I was fine, and then returning to whatever she had been doing. Because she had inherited from some ancestor, I declined to identify a core assumption that difficulties resolved themselves if you were patient enough. I thought about calling the palace security channel and asking to be connected to the emergency broadcast, and then remembered I didn't have the authorization code, and then decided that the administrative system had already logged me as present in the palace because my marker board had checked in that morning, and that someone at Transfer Station 4 would presumably be aware of the situation, and that there was very little I could do about any of it. I picked up my clipboard and went to find out what the palace's internal situation was. The palace ran on automated systems during a Tier 1. Climate, lighting, water, power, all cycling on their standard programs, unchanged. The internal movement restrictions only applied to external egress. Inside the building, I had full access to everywhere I normally went. The kitchen systems, I noted from the function board, were kept live under the protocol because the palace's emergency planning assumed some number of staff might shelter in place. And then there was the occupancy board. I almost missed it, reading through the panel listings. It was a small indicator lower right, the kind of administrative notation that sat below the primary function displays and only registered if you were looking for it. A single residential occupancy marker on the third tier, East Wing. Logged under the header accounted for secure protocol, with a notation that read simply, Prince SOVEL-RENTHOSS, secure residence. Do not disturb unless emergency. I looked at that for a while. The prince had not evacuated with the court. He had been logged as sheltering in his private chambers and noted in the security record as accounted for, which meant whoever had filed that notation had told the relevant parties not to worry, and the relevant parties had gone to Transfer Station 4 not worrying. The system had no flag for a missing person's concern. It had an indicator and a do not disturb notation and nothing else. I was alone in a sealed imperial palace with a member of the Ren-Thos dynasty in the east wing of the third residential tier, and I was a provisioning and general maintenance servitor from a city district that hadn't been considered fashionable since before my parents were born, and I was, as of approximately 5:15 hour, going to be here for somewhere between 3 and 7 days. I went to the kitchen. It was the most sensible place to go. I was also hungry. The kitchen was designed for 30 staff to produce meals for 100 at the minimum and twice that for formal occasions. Without anyone in it, it felt like a different room, the prep surfaces clean and bare, the cooking blocks dark and cold, the hanging racks above the central island orderly in a way they never were mid-service. The cold storage units ran their automated cycles and made their familiar low hum. The dry goods pantry was stocked for a month's standard household operation. The cold stores held provisions for the full residential cycle. I had, conservatively, enough food to last one person through 7 days, and a comfortable margin beyond that. I lit 2 cooking blocks, the main surface and the secondary, and started looking through the pantry. I settled on a grain and root stew because it was what I made on evenings at home when I couldn't think of anything better, which was most evenings, because I had spent the better part of 16 years cooking for a child who passed through phases of refusing food, with the arbitrariness of someone conducting a long-term experiment on parental patience. The grain I reached for was Sarath, the Ren-Thos kitchen staple, earthy and dense, with a depth that built slowly over an hour's simmer into something more than the sum of its parts. The roots I knew from 3 years of palace pantry reviews. I cooked for 2. I didn't decide to. It just happened. Years of habit, a kitchen with twice the food I needed, the particular reflex of a person who has been the consistent adult in a household for 16 years. I set out 2 bowls, not 1, before I noticed I'd done it, and by then the stew was already further along than I wanted to interrupt. I ate my portion standing at the prep surface. The servitor dining hall had the right furniture but the wrong feeling, a room built for 30. Lit for 30. echoing faintly even with one person in it. I ate in the kitchen where the cooking smell was, and the lights were the practical yellow-white of a working room rather than the warm ceremonial amber of the dining space. Then I put the second portion in the smallest covered serving vessel on the rack, and stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a while with it in my hand. Third tier, east wing. The notice had been unambiguous: secure residence, do not disturb unless emergency. Hunger did not, in the official categorization scheme of the Ren-Thas Imperial Court, constitute an emergency. The prince would have access to the residential cold storage on his tier. He would have the palace's automated climate and water systems. He would be, by the formal definition of the protocol, provided for. The residential cold storage on each tier held packaged preserved provisions, sealed containers of the kind used for emergency sheltering situations, nutritionally complete, shelf-stable, reconstituted with water from the tap. I had reviewed those containers when I'd done the third-tier supply check the previous month. They were exactly what they needed to be, which was to say, technically food, adequately sustaining, about as appealing as eating the packaging. I walked up to the third tier. I did not knock. The notice said not to disturb. I set the covered vessel and a piece of flat bread I had made while the stew was finishing on the floor outside the east wing chamber door, and I went back to the kitchen, and I thought no more about it until morning. In the morning, the vessel was outside the door again. It had been emptied, wiped clean with a care that suggested someone who had been raised never to enter a kitchen and had done their best anyway, and set back exactly where I had left it. The flatbread was gone. I took the vessel back down, washed it, and made breakfast. I found my rhythm in the first 2 days the way I always found my rhythm in unfamiliar situations, by doing what I knew how to do. In the mornings I cooked, because the kitchen was available and I had nothing else pressing, and standing at a cooking surface gave my hands something to do while my mind worked through the situation. I was not, by nature, a man who panicked. I had raised a child alone from the time that child was 13 months old, and there was a particular relationship with contingency that parenting instilled, not fearlessness, because I had been frightened for sale a dozen times and would be again, but a settled understanding that panic was rarely the first useful response to a problem. The problem here was simple. I was sealed in a palace for somewhere between 3 and 7 days. The palace had food, water, climate control, functioning light, and enough square footage to avoid going genuinely stir-crazy. I could maintain my routine. I could do my job or the portions of it that remained relevant. I could be useful, which was generally my preference. I cleaned the kitchen properly, which was not my job but was a thing that needed doing and that I was capable of. I ran a maintenance check on the heating vents in the service corridors, because that was my job, and 2 of them had been showing borderline readings for a week. I found a lighting strip in the third-tier access passage that had been flickering before the evacuation, and was now definitively failing, and replaced it from the sub-level utility stock, because a failing lighting strip in a passage someone was using was a hazard, and the person using that passage was the only other person in the building. I noted everything in the duty log because the duty log was running, and my head of maintenance would read it when the palace reopened, and I saw no reason to stop being professional about documentation just because I happened to be alone. In the evenings I cooked. I took a covered portion up to the east wing door and left it. In the mornings it was back, empty and clean. The palace at night was a different kind of quiet than it was during the day. The ventilation ran its steady undertone, but it had a different quality without the ambient noise of 30 people working below it. It became, rather than background, the dominant sound, an architectural breath that the building took and released in a slow cycle I had never noticed before. The lights in the unoccupied corridors ran at their automated minimum. I walked through them on the second evening for no particular reason beyond the fact that I had been in the kitchen and the servitor quarters and the maintenance sections and the service corridors, and I had not been anywhere else. And the strangeness of the empty palace had started to press against me in a way I recognized from the early years after Sale's mother left. The particular weight of a space that was built for more people than were in it. The residential levels were warmer in their light, pale gold from the strips in the ceiling, softer than the functional white of the service sections. I walked along the second-tier corridor and looked at the closed doors and thought about all the small rituals that had been interrupted when the alarm went. Meals half planned, work half done, conversations stopped mid-word by a klaxon and a transport deadline. Whole lives suspended in amber for the duration of an orbital precaution. On the third tier, east wing, a line of light showed under a door. I had known it would be there. I had walked that passage twice already on the way to and from leaving trays. But that evening, I stood in front of it longer than I needed to, listening to the building, and thought about the young man on the other side of it eating from a reconstituted emergency provision pack for the second day in a row. I went back to the kitchen and set a pot to simmer for the morning. The smell was what did it. I had started a proper stew early on the afternoon of the third day, not the quick grain enroute of the first evening, but something more deliberate, built slow, the kind of dish that needed 3 hours and repaid every minute. Soreth grain simmered with a spice base I had spent 2 years learning to not over-apply, and 2 varieties of root that broke down differently at low heat, and a broth from the pantry stocks that smelled, once it had been going for 90 minutes, like nothing so much as a late autumn afternoon somewhere with better weather than I had ever lived in. The kitchen held it, rich, deep, something between sweet and savory that the ventilation distributed through the residential tier access corridor, and I had not thought about this but perhaps should have, under the east wing door. I was at the cooking surface with my back to the kitchen entrance, adjusting the heat, when I heard the footstep. One careful footstep in the service corridor, then a pause, then another. The walk of someone who had moved through marble and formal parquet their entire life and had now encountered the dimmer, more practical surfaces of the service level for the first time and was not entirely certain what to make of them. The kitchen door opened slowly. I had a daughter who had stood in kitchen doorways at odd hours for reasons that were not exactly hunger since she was about 9 years old. I recognized the quality of the pause in the doorway without needing to turn around. I said, "There's enough in the pot." A longer pause than I expected. Then a voice, carefully constructed to be formal, slightly unsteady at the edges, the voice of someone very young doing very old things. Excuse me. I was not aware anyone was present. I turned around. He was standing in the doorway in a residential coat, the 3/4 length garment the Ren Thas gentry wore when they were not in formal attire, deep gray with pale piping at the collar. This particular one worn soft at the lapels and slightly too long in the sleeve, the kind of personal wear that outlasted the formality it had been made for. Tall, the way the Ren Thas tended to be, with the pale gray-silver complexion of his family line and the wide silver-irised eyes that I had seen in the ceremonial portraits in the public corridors, but which looked, in a kitchen doorway under functional lighting, considerably more human than portraits usually managed. Fine-boned features, high-bridged nose, the long, elegant line of his jaw, all carrying the composed formality of someone trained to present well. He was also, quite visibly, hungry, the specific lean look that came from 2 days on emergency provisions, and more than hungry, he was something else. Something young and badly hidden, the kind of expression that had been controlled so thoroughly and for so long that the effort of maintaining it was beginning to show through. He looked at me. I looked at him. I thought of Sale at 14, standing in a kitchen doorway at 11 at night with her chin up and her eyes a little too bright. Too proud to say she'd had a difficult day. I said the tray wasn't quite enough then. He looked at the pot, he looked at me. It was adequate. He said this with the precise neutrality of someone who had learned to mean adequate when he said adequate and was currently lying about that. The bread was, he stopped, started again. Yes. I turned back to the stove. Sit down. Not Vel Sovel, not Your Highness, not any of the 17 forms the staff orientation had listed as acceptable address for a member of the imperial family. Just, sit down. The thing I said to Sale when she showed up in the kitchen, and I didn't want to make a ceremony out of it. A long pause behind me, long enough that I began to think he wouldn't. Then the sound of the second chair, the one I had been setting out at the prep table every evening for 2 days without thinking about why, moving across the floor, and him sitting. I served the stew. He ate the whole bowl, and I was glad I had made a full pot because the bowl he emptied was not a small one. I ate mine across from him, and that I could see was the part that surprised him most. Not the food, which was presumably better than what he'd been eating, but the sitting across. People did not sit across from him and eat the same food. People served him, stood in careful attendance, withdrew. Nobody sat down and picked up a spoon. I ate my stew. After a while I said, "How long have you been in the East Wing?" He processed the question with a deliberateness I would come to recognize as his particular style, not slowness, not hesitation, but a precision about words that suggested he measured them before he released them. "Since the precaution was called," he said, "approximately 44 hours. On the preserved provisions the whole time. The cold storage unit on my residential tier contained suitable." A pause. He looked at his empty bowl. He said more quietly, "Yes." "Those are terrible," I said. He looked at me. A different expression from the one he had come in wearing. Something fractionally unsure, as though I had used a word he understood individually but not in this combination. I got up and refilled his bowl before he could calculate whether to ask. He didn't thank me. He held himself together very carefully through the first half of the second serving, the formal fork hold, the measured pace of someone who had been watched at every meal since childhood and had internalized the watching. I ate my stew the way I always ate it, which was without any ceremony at all, and I watched his fork loosen incrementally, the careful grip becoming a natural one, the measured bites becoming simply eating, the way a person ate when the food was right and nobody was watching. I said Davin Moore's, provisioning and general maintenance, 3rd year. He set his fork down. He said, "Sovel Ren Thas." No title, no formal address form, just the name. I don't know whether he decided to or whether it came out of its own accord. "I know," I said. "Your occupancy indicator was on the administrative board in the service hub. That's how I knew there was someone in the East Wing." "I see." He turned this over. "You should have reported to the emergency channel." "The emergency channel requires an authorization code held by the Household Security Division," I said. "I'm provisioning and maintenance. I don't have it." "Ah," a brief pause. "And you were not evacuated because—" "Inventory in the sub-level storerooms," I said. "Missed the alarm, missed the transport. I ate 10 minutes." He was quiet for a moment. "That is very nearly." "Yes," I said. "We ate." When the bowl was empty a second time, he said, with the careful vocal flatness of someone reporting a fact rather than giving a compliment, "It is very good." "Sareth grain," I said. "It needs time. You can tell it's ready by the smell when it stops smelling like the raw grain and starts smelling like something underneath it, something older." He looked at me with an expression I could not quite classify. "I will take your word for it," he said. "You don't cook," I said, not a question. "No," he said, "simple. No apology, no explanation, just the fact of it." I said, "I'll send something in the mornings as well, breakfast." He looked at me steadily. "That isn't necessary." "No," I said, "but I make breakfast regardless, and there's no shortage of food. And if you're going to be in the East Wing for another several days on emergency provisions when there's a stocked kitchen on the service level, that's an administrative oversight I'm in a position to correct." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked down at the table. I thought I saw the corner of his mouth move. He did not refuse. I cleared the bowls. He watched me take them to the washing station, and there was a quality to that watching, alert, a little uncertain, the way a person watched a process they had been observing all their life from the receiving end and had never seen from this angle. Does someone else generally, he began. In normal operation, yes, I said. Kitchen staff handle it. There are 16 of them on a standard shift. I set the bowls in the wash basin. Tonight there's me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and he came to the basin and he said, with the precision of someone who had committed to a thing, "What do I do?" I looked at him. "Run the hot water," I said, "and use the scrub on the left side of the rack." He ran the hot water. He found the scrub. He washed a bowl with the careful thoroughness of someone performing a procedure they had read about and were now attempting for the first time, which was endearing and also not very efficient, and when he was done, he held the bowl up to the light to inspect it. "Is that sufficient?" he said. "It's very sufficient," I said. He washed the second bowl with slightly more confidence. "I thought there you are." In the morning he came down before I had finished with the flatbread. Quieter footsteps than the previous evening, like he had learned the stairs overnight. He came in and sat at the table without being told, which was an improvement, and I put the flatbread and a small crock of the grain preserve I'd found in the back of the pantry between us, and sat across from him with my bark steep. He looked at the flatbread, he looked at the preserve, he looked at me. "Help yourself," I said. He looked at the table in the particular way of someone who had never had to help himself to anything in his life, and was recalculating. I tore off a piece of flat bread, spread it with grain preserve, and put it on the edge of the table closest to him. He picked it up. We ate in a silence that became, by the time the bread was gone, something almost comfortable. "What did you do yesterday?" I asked. He considered the question. I reviewed administrative correspondence, secondary circuit reports from the forward stations, a 3-week backlog. There was also he paused. "Is that what you mean?" "I meant how you spent the day in general," I said. He looked at the table. "That primarily," and I read. There are physical volumes in my chambers, historical mostly. I read a considerable portion of the 4th volume of the Thas campaign journals. "Cheerful reading," I said. "No," he said, with enough immediacy that I thought it was the most unguarded thing he had said since arriving. He recovered. His 4th campaign included a 14-month siege of a fortified position that had, it transpired, been evacuated before he arrived. He maintained the siege in its entirety before this became apparent. 14 months, I said. Yes. He held his bark-steep cup without drinking from it. I find myself, in the current circumstances, somewhat sympathetic to his position. I said it could be worse. You could be laying siege to an empty palace. He looked at me across the table, and this time the corner of his mouth moved more clearly. "The situation," he said, with such precise neutrality that it took me a moment to understand it, was the closest thing to a compliment he had produced in 30 years of being carefully trained to produce formal ones, "is considerably improved since yesterday evening." "The bread is nothing special," I said. "I'll make something better for midday. There's enough in the pantry for a proper meal if I start it now." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said with great care, "Thank you, Moors." "Davin," I said. He stopped. "Davin," I said again. "It's what I prefer. The formal system is a bit much for a kitchen table." A pause. He turned his cup in his hands, long fingers wrapping the ceramic with the same precision he brought to everything. Then he said, "Very well, Davin." He said it like he was checking the weight of it. The second day was the root vegetables. He had come in at midday and asked, with the elaborate casualness of someone who had been rehearsing the question, whether there was anything he could do. I was at the cooking surface with a sauce at a stage that needed watching, and I thought about what the answer to that question actually was, and I said, "Do you know how to slice a root vegetable?" He said he believed so. He did not know how to slice a root vegetable. He knew how a knife was held in the way that someone knew how a knife was held because they had been in rooms where knives were held, and the information had entered them by proximity rather than practice. He made a cut that went about a quarter of the way through the root at an angle that suggested it had planned to go somewhere other than down. I said, "Flat side down first. It'll roll otherwise." He turned the root flat side down, with the focused care of a man diffusing something fragile. He made a second cut. It went most of the way through at a somewhat better angle. "Good," I said, "keep them even, a thumb width apart roughly." He worked through the roots with the complete, undivided attention of someone for whom competence was not negotiable, and failure was therefore to be approached with systematic thoroughness rather than accepted. Each cut was individually considered. The results were each individually different. By the time he had finished 3 roots, the sauce was done and I had assembled the rest of the dish. And I turned back to find him studying his handiwork with an expression suspended between satisfaction and honest appraisal. "They are not entirely uniform," he said. "First attempt," I said. "They're fine." I swept them into the pot. "Next time keep the guide hand further back, you'll get more control." He looked up at me. "Next time," he said. "There are more roots in the pantry," I said, "and we're here for at least 3 more days." A pause, then with considerable dignity, "I will improve." "I know," I said, and I meant it the same way I meant it when I said it to Sale, not as encouragement, as a fact about who he was. He looked at me when I said it, and I thought something landed in him that he had not been expecting to receive. He went to wash his hands. He did this with the same methodical care he brought to the knife, the same attention to doing a thing correctly once he had understood that there was a correct way. I watched him from the corner of my eye and thought that someone had taught him, very thoroughly and from a very young age, that everything worth doing was worth doing properly, and that nobody had told him there were things where done was sufficient. The afternoon of the 3rd day, we were sitting on the bench along the far prep surface with the slow stew I'd started that morning running at low heat, and he asked about my daughter. It came out of a longer conversation that had wandered. We had been talking about the campaign journals he'd been reading, and then about Kervthos II's command style, and then about the way supply chains had worked in the era of the journals compared to now, which was actually an interesting subject, and one he had unexpectedly formed opinions about. And somewhere in the middle of it, I mentioned having made a particular sauce at home the previous spring when Sale was down with a chest complaint and wouldn't eat anything sharp. He was quiet a moment, then, "She is ill often." "No," I said, "that once. Generally she's very healthy, stubborn constitution. She considers being ill an inconvenience the world is specifically visiting on her." "How old is she?" 16, I said. 17 next month." He looked at the steam rising from the cooking block and the way he looked at things when he was working through something. "And she is in the city while you are posted here." "My residential quarters are single occupancy. Standard staff housing isn't sized for children." I looked at the pot. "She lives with my sister. It was the practical arrangement." "Do you see her regularly?" "4th rest day rotation," I said. "Every 4 weeks. I paused. "She manages." He was quiet again. Then he said, with the tonal absence he used when he was saying something that cost him something and was not going to show the cost, "She has a father who insures her." I looked at him. He was looking at the pot. His expression was the composed one, the formal one, the one that had been built very young and maintained very carefully. But underneath it was the thing I had been seeing at the edges since the first evening. A young man who had been accounted for and attended to and logged as present in the appropriate records his entire life, and who was not at all certain that any of those things were the same as what he had just said. I said carefully, Your father has a great many demands on his attention. The emperor has considerable responsibilities, Soval agreed, with the smooth, worn quality of a sentence that had been said and thought so many times it had lost the shape of its original meaning. And your brother is the heir, I said. A pause, yes. The second son has a different position, I said. It was a question wearing the shape of a statement, and he heard it as both. The heir requires particular preparation, he said. Continuous engagement, mentorship, proximity to the decision-making processes of the court. The second son provides contingency. The second son is present, accounted for. He said this word in the tone of someone who had spent a long time making peace with it. It is not an ungrateful position. There are freedoms in it. But not the ones you choose, I said. He looked at me. It was the look I was beginning to be able to read, the slight recalibration of someone who kept expecting me to stay on the surface of things and kept being caught when I didn't. The diplomatic rotation is broad, he said. It is designed for flexibility, whatever the dynasty requires. He paused. I would prefer to work in supply administration. Why supply? He turned his cup in his hands. Because when I read the forward station dispatches, and I have been reading them for the better part of 3 months in the Administrative Correspondence Division, the recurring problems are almost never problems of policy. They are problems of what reaches people and when. The policy is adequate. The supply chains are not consistently adequate. He looked at the pot. That is fixable work, the kind of work where you can see the result. And nobody thinks it's a very important post, I said. He looked at me with the expression that meant something had landed closer to center than he had expected. It is not considered a distinguished appointment, he said. Important work often isn't, I said. The glamorous work has no shortage of people who want to do it. The supply chains are harder to fill. I got up and checked the stew. You should do it. He was quiet for a long time. I said, my daughter does a thing that makes me feel like I'm 4 months behind on understanding who she is every time I see her. She has a particular way of deciding what she's going to do and then simply doing it. And by the time I've registered that she's decided, she's already done it and moved on to what comes next. I stirred the pot. I think that's something you have, the deciding part. He was still quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet, something working through it. I said she'd be 17 in less than a month, and I'm not there for it. Rest day rotation puts me a week out. I've been thinking about that. I set the spoon down. I was thinking about it in the sub-level storerooms when I should have been listening for the alarm. He looked up at me. So I am here, I said, partly because I was thinking about whether I would be back in the city before her birthday, and I missed the klaxon, and now I am going to miss it regardless, and there is nothing to be done about that. I sat back down on the bench. The point of telling you this is that the thing you said about your father, I understand it. Different situation, but the shape of it. He was looking at his cup. His face had lost its formal composition, or most of it. What was underneath was younger, tired a little, honest. After a while he said, very quietly, she is fortunate to have someone who thinks about it. I did not say anything. We sat on the bench in the warm kitchen, and the stew simmered, and the palace was quiet around us, and I let that sit where he had put it. When I got up to stir the pot again, I said, it'll be another hour. You can go back up if you want to, or you can stay here. He stayed. On the 4th day, I made a proper dinner. Not the daily provisions pot, not the practical quick-cooked things I'd been making for 2 of us. A proper dinner, from the palace kitchen's actual recipe board. The kind of meal the head cook produced for first-level formal occasions. I had the recipe, I had the ingredients, I had 4 hours, and I had been thinking all morning that this was the man's palace, and he had been eating from a daily stew pot, and that seemed like an unnecessary oversight to continue when I was capable of doing something about it. He came in at some point in the afternoon and found me in the middle of it and sat on the bench without asking, and picked up one of the historical volumes I had brought down from the servitor common room shelves and read, and I cooked, and neither of us said anything about the other being there. The kitchen smelled extraordinary by the end of the preparation. The spice balance in the sauce was the best I had managed in 3 years of working with Ren Thas flavors, and I thought my head cook would have been grudgingly impressed, and the thought pleased me in the mild private way of someone doing their job well in an empty room. I set the serving preparation surface at the far end of the kitchen as a proper table. 2 places, arranged by the palace protocol I had looked up because it seemed like the right thing to do once. He looked at it from the bench when I turned around, and then he looked at me, and he closed his book and came to the table. We ate the formal kitchen dinner at a service-level prep surface in an evacuated imperial palace, and I thought this while I was eating it, which was unusual for me, genuinely good. Not the best cooking I had ever done, but close. And he ate it the way I had been watching him slowly learn to eat things, which was without ceremony, without performance, simply eating because the food was good and the company was easy. We talked about the campaign journals, about the 14-month siege, and what a man thought about in an empty fortress waiting for something that had already left. About the district I was from, and the work I'd done before the palace posting, which was maintenance and provisioning in various forms, and had been since I was 19, because I had a talent for understanding what things needed, and a patience for the work of making sure they had it. He listened to this with the same quality of attention he brought to the root vegetables, precise, genuine, asking questions that were better than the surface of things. He told me about the diplomatic rotation in more detail than he had before. The forward station attachments, the correspondence work, the administrative review processes he had been learning for 3 months. He spoke about it with the particular affect of someone describing a thing they were committed to without being entirely convinced of its fit, like a coat that was the right size but cut for someone else's proportions. At some point, when the main plates were done and I had gotten up to see what the kitchen offered for something sweet, he said, "My brother asked me, before I left for this rotation, what I would do when it was finished. I found a dish of preserved keth fruit in the cold store, pale oval, sharp sweet, the Ren Thas equivalent of something to put on the table when dinner was winding down, and brought it back." "What did you tell him?" I said. I said I hadn't decided. He looked at the keth fruit. That was not entirely honest. I had decided, I simply had not said it. "And now?" He looked at me across the table. "I am going to request the supply administration post," he said, not with the careful tonal absence, with something more direct than that. "Good," I said. He looked at me for a moment longer, then he picked up a piece of keth fruit. I poured a second cup of bark steep, because the habit had formed and the pot was there. He accepted it and held it and did not drink it, as was his pattern, and after a while I said, "You've never liked this." He looked at the cup, a pause, then no. "Then stop accepting it," I said. "I'll make something else. I found a dried leaf infusion in the back of the pantry last week that's considerably less medicinal." He held my look for a moment, and then something happened in his expression, not the usual careful recalibration, but something more straightforward than that. Relief, maybe, or the specific ease of being told that a small, long-maintained accommodation was unnecessary. He set the cup down, deliberately, precisely, and did not pick it up again. "Good," I said again, and went to find the dried leaf infusion. We sat in the kitchen's warmth with the right drink between us and talked until the palace's automated lighting shifted to its low residential cycle, the cool service white fading to the amber of the evening setting, and I thought, this is what the inside of something should be. Not the outside over, not the world paused, not the abnormal normalized. Just 2 people in a warm room talking, because they are there and it is evening and there is nothing more pressing than being in the same place at the same time. In the morning of the 5th day, I was stirring porridge when the palace public address system clicked on. A recorded voice, clipped and official, Tier 1 orbital precaution, resolved, palace clearance lifting, resumption of standard operations, staff return transport inbound, estimated arrival 10th hour. I kept stirring. The porridge was sareth, cooked soft, with dried keth fruit from the cold store because I had found that it worked well in the morning grain, and I had been told there would be more of it next month, and so I had stopped being conservative about it. I heard his footsteps on the service corridor stairs. Not the cautious first evening step, not the learn the stairs step of the subsequent days, but simply his footsteps, the natural rhythm of someone who had come to know a building. He came in and sat at the table and looked at me, and I looked at him, and neither of us said anything about the announcement. I served the porridge. We ate. The keth fruit in the grain caught the morning light where it hit the prep surface and was a very particular shade of pale gold. I said, the dried fruit from the cold store reserve. I've been using it throughout. Your head cook will have notes. He looked at the bowl. You have it noted in your duty log. The quantity used, yes. He'll have an opinion about it. He will have an opinion about many things, Soval said. His opinions about the kitchen inventory are generally well-founded. He ate a spoonful. I will tell him the use was approved. I looked at him. You can do that, I said, meaning you are the prince you always could have. Yes, he said. He said it without the previous weight of the word, the one that had meant something like the position is more complicated than you might expect. He said it plainly as a simple fact. I can. We finished the porridge. He helped clear the bowls and wash them with the improving competence of someone who had now done this several times, and had started to understand what done looked like from the inside rather than only from the other side of it. His cuts on the last batch of roots, 2 days prior, had been nearly uniform. I had not told him they were nearly uniform because he would find out in the doing, which was better. I set the kitchen in order. He helped, moving with the ease of someone who had learned the room's logic over 4 days. When it was done, we both stood at the kitchen entrance, the door that connected the service level to the residential access corridor, and looked back at the space we had been occupying together for the better part of a week. The head cook will arrive with the return transport, he said. I know, I said. He'll find the duty log current and the kitchen in order. Yes, a pause. I expect he will. We stood in the doorway for another moment. Davin, he said. Yes. He looked at me with the wide silver eyes that had lost their careful guard over the course of 5 days and were now simply his. A young man's eyes, a little tired, honest. Thank you, he said, not with any formal apparatus, just the words. You're welcome, I said, just the words. He went up the corridor stairs, and I heard his footsteps all the way to the 3rd tier, unhurried. And then I didn't hear them anymore, and the kitchen was quiet with the particular quality of a room that has been fully used and well maintained, and is now simply waiting for what comes next. The court arrived at the 10th hour. The palace became noise again. I was in the servitor common room with my duty log when the first cohort came through, administrative staff, security personnel, the junior household. I had changed into my best work clothes, which were distinguishable from the second set by the absence of a mend in the left cuff. Beyond that, I was not, as a provisioning and maintenance servitor, prepared to go significantly further in the direction of formality. The common room filled around me. People were talking, comparing notes on the evacuation, asking who had been at which transfer station. I answered questions about the palace's status as accurately as I could. The duty log had what they needed. The head cook arrived in the second cohort and went directly to the kitchen, and found it in the order I had said it would be in. He came to the common room afterward, and stood in the doorway with the particular expression he wore when he had prepared himself to find fault and had not found it. He said, the Sareth reserves are down. Noted in the log, I said. You cooked with the Sareth reserves, he said. Yes, I said. He looked at the log which I handed him. He was quiet for a while reading. Then he said, breakfast preparation, residential tier request. Yes, I said. He looked up at me. Residential tier, he said. Yes, I said. He looked at me for a long time. Then he turned a page, then another. He said, the third tier lighting strip. It was failing before the evacuation, I said. I replaced it from sub-level utility stock. It's noted. He closed the log and handed it back. The Keth fruit in the cold store, he said. It's the seasonal reserve. It's for formal table service. I used some of it, I said. In the morning porridge, I've been told there will be more in a month. He looked at me steadily. By whom? He said. By the prince, I said. There was a pause of a specific quality. By the prince, he said. Yes, I said. He stood in the doorway for another long moment. Then he turned and went back to his kitchen, and I heard him, through the service passage, beginning his own thorough inventory with the resigned efficiency of a man who has expected disorder and found scrupulous records instead, and is not entirely certain what to do with the feeling. The formal summons came at 14th hour, delivered by Orvala Wren, the palace administrative registrar, a thin, gray-complected man whose bearing suggested that his schedule had been interrupted by the Tier 1, and the 5 days since had not been adequate to restore his equilibrium. He arrived at the common room with 2 security attendants and a written notice, and told me I was required at the imperial reception hall at 16th hour for a formal acknowledgement before His Imperial Majesty, care of Wren Thas. I looked at the notice. I said, I'll need a few minutes. Orvala Wren looked at me. You are already in your working attire. This is my second best set, I said. My best set is in the locker. Orvala Wren drew a long administrative breath. 16th hour, Moors, he said, and left. The Imperial Reception Hall held the returned court in its 3 tiers. I stood in the lower level with the other service and maintenance staff and watched the ceremony proceed through its proper sequence. The senior household acknowledged first, then the administrative cohort, then the service staff. The Emperor care of Wren Thas moved through it with the ease of long practice. He was a taller and older edition of his son, the same family line in its further stage. The same pale gray-silver complexion, the same high bones, but set harder by age and the accumulation of formal occasions, the kind of face that had been performing composure for so long that composure was what it had become. When the acknowledgments reached the service cohort, Orvala Wren brought me forward. I stood in front of the Emperor of the Wren Thas dynasty in my best work clothes and decided to put my hands at my sides, because that seemed like the least complicated option. The Emperor looked at me. Davin Moors. Yes, I said then, Your Majesty. You were sealed in the palace during the precaution. Yes, Your Majesty. I was in the sub-level storerooms during the alarm and missed the 5th hour transport. I am told, the Emperor said, and he said this with the weight of a man who has been told something he was not expecting and has had some hours to process it, that you maintain the palace's service functions for the full duration of the precaution. I kept the duty log current and maintained what was in my section, I said. The palace's automated systems handled everything else. I am also told, he said, that you kept my son fed and looked after for the duration of that period. The hall was quite quiet. I thought about what I wanted to say and what was accurate. I said, I was cooking anyway, Your Majesty. I left a covered portion at his door because that seemed like the right thing to do. He came down to the kitchen on the 3rd evening and I put out a chair. It seemed like the reasonable approach. The Emperor regarded me for a moment. Soval describes it somewhat more fully than that, he said. Soval is generous, I said. A pause that carried in it something I couldn't quite read, something that might, from a different kind of face, have been wryness. He proposes, the Emperor said, that you be appointed to the post of Chief Provisioner of the Imperial Household. The position carries first-tier residential quarters and a formal salary commensurate with the rank. The hall was very quiet. I thought about the kitchen table, about root vegetables sliced with increasing precision, about a young man learning to say what he actually thought about a drink he didn't like, about a second son who had decided he was going to do the unglamorous important work and had said so out loud, which was the step that mattered. I said, "Your Majesty, that is an extraordinarily generous offer, and I am genuinely grateful for it. But I have a daughter who lives in the city, and she's 17 next month, and my current posting and my rest day rotation are what they are because that's what the job allows. I would like, if it's acceptable, to go back to that." Silence. The Emperor looked at me with the measuring quality of a man who had not expected this response and was reassessing. "The post includes residential provision," he said. "There are quarters adjacent." "She's finishing her last school year," I said. "She's done well there and it's important to her, and I don't want to disrupt that." I paused. "I'd rather see her on 4th rest days and have her finish what she started." The silence extended. Then the Emperor said, "You are certain?" "Yes, Your Majesty." He held my look for a long moment. The formal face did not change, but something behind it did, something that looked at me and recognized, I thought, the particular set of a decision made cleanly and without regret. He said, "The position remains open, should your circumstances change." "Thank you," I said, "Your Majesty." Orvala Wren guided me back to the service section. I went. Soval was in the service corridor when I came through the door at the end of the ceremony. Not in the court attire he had worn during the reception. He had changed back to the residential coat, the one with the worn collar, and he was standing in the corridor with his hands in his pockets in the manner of someone who had decided not to stand formally and was committing to that decision. He looked at me. I said, "You could have warned me." "You would have found a way to decline the warning," he said. A pause. "I thought the offer should reach you as itself." "That was probably accurate," I said. "The supply administration post." "I submitted the request this morning," he said, "before the court returned." "Good," I said. We stood in the service corridor for a moment. The palace was running at full operation around us. The sound of 30 staff and 200 residents returning to their routines, filling the spaces that had been empty and quiet for 5 days. It was the right sound for a palace. It just took some adjusting to. He reached into his coat pocket and took something out and held it toward me. It was a marker chip, small and flat, the size of my thumbnail, pale metal with a seal worked into one face in finer detail than the official correspondence versions I had handled in the provisioning paperwork. The personal seal design, not the dynasty mark, the individual one. "If you present this at any Ren Thas administrative station," he said, "it opens the household assistance channel. Any purpose. It requires no explanation and no authorization code beyond the chip itself." I looked at it. I thought about rest day rotations and a city district with unreliable transit and a daughter who would be 17 in a month and who managed, very competently, and whom I was going to miss. I took the chip. "Thank you," I said, "Your Highness." He looked at me when I said that. "Soval," he said. I looked at him. He was 21 years old and he had learned to slice a root vegetable and to set down a drink he didn't like and to say what he was going to do before he did it. He was going to be, not in the way the formal record said, not logged and accounted for, but actually, all right. "Soval," I said. He held my look for a moment. Then he straightened, settling into himself the way a person settled when they had made peace with a thing, and he said, "Go home, Davin." "I intend to," I said. The transit shuttle reached my sister's district an hour before evening. I had my kit and my duty log and the marker chip in my breast pocket. I walked the 4 streets from the transit stop in the particular way I walked those streets, which was the way of someone who had done it many times, and knew exactly where the uneven paving began, and where the noodle shop on the ground floor of my sister's building would start to be detectable. The building's entry hall smelled of the noodle shop. It always smelled of the noodle shop. I had grown up 4 streets from here and come back to it after my wife left and stayed until the palace posting, and the smell of it was, at this particular moment, the best thing about the outside. My sister opened the door and looked at me. "You're back," she said. "Yes," I said. "Sale said you were sealed in." "I was," I said. She studied me with the assessment she used when she was deciding whether to pursue a subject. Then she stepped back and let me in. Sale was at the kitchen table with her schoolwork spread out around her in the particular disorder that meant she had been working on it rather than performing working on it. She looked up when I came through the door. She had grown in the month since I had last seen her. She had grown, or possibly the memory of her had not kept pace, because she was taller than the person I had been thinking of during 5 days in the palace, and her face had moved again into another version of itself, the way her face kept moving when I wasn't watching. She said, "You were stuck the whole time." "Yes," I said. "Were you okay?" "Yes," I said. "Were you bored?" she said. I thought about the kitchen, about Sareth grain and the smell of something deep underneath it when it was ready, about root vegetables sliced with increasing precision and a cup set down deliberately and not picked up again, about an easy silence at a table with enough room at it for 2 people to each be themselves. "Not particularly," I said. She looked at me for a moment with the expression I had never quite learned to read, the one she had been developing since she was about 12, where something registered fully and was filed immediately and would surface later in a question I hadn't expected. Then she went back to her schoolwork. I sat down at my sister's kitchen table. It was smaller than the palace prep surface and had a chip out of one corner I had been meaning to fix since before the palace posting. The overhead light ran slightly uneven, one of the 3 ceiling panels a little cooler than the others. My sister put tea in front of me, real tea, the kind I had grown up drinking, from the box in the second cabinet. I wrapped my hands around the cup. Outside, the city ran its evening. My sister moved in the small kitchen. Sale turned a page. The marker chip sat in my breast pocket, flat and warm as a thumbnail pressed there. I thought the palace was the inside, and inside was all right while the outside was sealed. But the outside was fine now. The outside was here, and here was exactly right.